As I once said to my people, though I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. I did not say it lightly then, and I do not repeat it lightly now. It is a truth I have carried like a hidden crown for as long as I can remember. I am Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry and Anne, survivor of courts, prisons, and storms, both political and personal. Some call me the Virgin Queen, others Gloriana. To myself, I am simply Elizabeth, a woman who learned to stand upright in high winds. Tonight, I will tell you everything. The morning my breath turned to frost as the word majesty crossed another's lips, the tower that nearly ended me, the battle won with weather and will, the love I never owned and never forgot, and the mask that guarded me until it grew too heavy to bear. Do you think you could rule a kingdom, not in a ballad, but in the unkind light of dawn, with people's lives piled, unseen, upon your sleeve? That is where my story begins. Hatfield House, December 1558. I woke to hurried feet and hushed voices, the faint ring of metal on metal. My chamber was cold enough to make a small cloud whenever I breathed. Frost embroidered the panes like white ivy. I sat up slowly, the weight of blankets slipping, a drum beat in my temples. I reached for last night's tea and found it bitter and thin, like a decision made too late. Even before the words arrived, the air had already decided. There are seconds in a life when you are moved forward without your consent, like being told suddenly that you're flying a plane you didn't know you boarded, the cockpit lit, the sky enormous, the passengers silent, and no one offering you an instruction manual. The knock was low and deliberate. My ladies entered, faces pale from carrying a message too heavy for their hands. One knelt by my bed. Her voice broke softly on the stone of the moment. "Your Majesty." With 2 syllables I crossed a river. The bells began their tolling, slow as oars. I was no longer merely Elizabeth, inconvenient daughter of a famous king and a vanished mother. I had become the hinge between a restless past and a waiting future. Strange what the mind does. I looked at an old chest in the corner, gowns I would never wear again, moods I would never keep. The rooster crowed in the distance, as stubborn and cheerful, as if dawn were nothing but dawn. England had lost one queen and gained another before anyone had buttered the morning bread. They brought me to the great hall. Men with practiced courtesies gathered like chess pieces, eyes gauging, measuring, wagering. Some looked at me as if I were a miracle, others as if I were merely a problem in a new dress. A gentleman bowed so low I feared for his spine, rose, and immediately began a delicate soliloquy on the treasury. Imagine it, the kingdom still adjusting the crown upon my head, and already we were counting coins. "Good sirs," I said, "let us have the courtesy to finish our morning bread before we starve the country into ruin." A few smiles escaped their owners' lips. Unguarded, human. Humour has always been my little lantern, not bright enough to blind, but enough to keep us from walking into the furniture. If you, listening now, find warmth in this midnight company, if wandering my sleepless corridors steadies your own, then grant me a small favour a queen seldom asks. Tap subscribe. Consider it a tiny oath of loyalty. Even queens enjoy a little faithful company. I stood very still, aware that stillness is a kind of music. Every tilt of the head is a sentence, Every silence an argument. I could feel what they wanted from me, proof that I would not break, proof that I could be both steel and silk. But fear, when you meet it correctly, often thins to clarity. The cold air pared away the unessential, led, protect, endure. Power is not a shout, it is a steady breath. If your life has ever promoted you without asking, made you parent to your own parents, manager to chaos, pilot to a storm, then you know this. Courage is less trumpet than spine. You do not wait until you are unafraid. You pick up the day like a wet cloak and you wear it until it warms. Let me be plain about the journey ahead, so you know why you should stay until the last candle gutters. I will take you back to iron doors and a sky the colour of sorrow, when the tower held me, and every footstep in the corridor sounded like a verdict. I will lead you into the council chamber, where I learned to command a room in which every chair expected me to fail. We will pass through the garden of suitors, portraits flatter than the men who sent them, and talk about choosing one vow over all others, my country. We will stand on the shore of 1588 and hear the heartbeat of England rise against the Armada, and I will read you a speech that stitched fear into courage. I will show you the letter I kept after Robert Dudley left this world, and what it costs to love when your life belongs to everyone. And then we will face the mirror, the white paint, the red lip, the gilded hair, and consider the mask you wear and the ones you can finally put down. By the end you will not have my crown, but you may have my compass, how to lead when you are tired, how to be gentle without being small, how to hold your line when the crowd insists you be someone else. The day itself unfolded as important days always do, too quickly and with too many hands upon it. Envoys were notified, prayers arranged, papers signed. The corridors carried a new sound, the hush that follows when power moves from one body to another. I remember the taste of ink on my tongue from biting a quill, the way habit conquers panic. Leadership is often a choreography of unromantic tasks, performed with unwavering tenderness. You do not need a throne to practice it. You need a morning, a decision you did not want, and the willingness to make your voice the room's temperature instead of its echo. Yet no crown settles without waking old storms. In the pauses between ceremonies, my mind slipped sideways to another door opening years before, when the world had called me not majesty, but prisoner. I can tell you now that the memory of a key turning can be louder than any fanfare. There is a rhythm to dread. Once you have danced to it, you can recognize the music under any melody. Perhaps that is why I learned to stand so still, because I had already learned how not to tremble. If you are listening in the dark and wondering what any of this has to do with your life, your inboxes, your children's questions, your unmade choices, know this. I too woke into a role I did not feel ready to play. I too mistook worry for wisdom, silence for consent, busyness for strength. What changed me was not the crown, but the practice, choosing words that stitched rather than tore, setting boundaries with kindness, trusting the weather when it favoured us, and trusting our wits when it did not, and remembering that solitude is not emptiness if you fill it with honest thought. These are small sovereign acts, and they are available to you even in a studio apartment with a stubborn radiator and a plant you keep meaning to water. By evening the castle had learned my name in a new voice. Candles pricked the dusk, the air smelled faintly of wax and old wood. When I finally stood alone, I pressed my palm flat against the cool glass of the window and watched the sky turn the colour of pomegranate. It looked as it often does at the start of a rain or the end of a love, both tender and dangerous. I thought of my mother, of a girl who had been taught early that rooms could change their meanings in a breath, and I understood clearly, calmly, that courage would not be my occasional visitor. It would be my daily bread. But before I had bread or crown, there was a morning when the door opened and the guards stepped in. Before the throne taught me to stand, the stone taught me not to fall. Before the gold, iron. Before the cheers, a silence so deep it felt like snow. Before the crown, I knew the tower, and the day I thought my life had ended, before it began. Before the crown, I knew the tower, cold walls thicker than a man's courage, stones that smelled of centuries and secrets. The air itself felt damp, as if it had been trapped there since the last prisoner left. Even now, years later, I can recall the sound of my own footsteps echoing back at me, as though the building wished to remind me I was the only living thing foolish enough to walk its corridors. It was March 1554 when I entered those gates, not as a queen, but as a suspect. My half-sister Mary sat on the throne, and I in her shadow. The accusation was treason, of course, it so often is. They said I had conspired with rebels to take her crown. I had not, but innocence is a weak shield against fear when the crown suspects you. You may know the feeling in another shape, when you are accused of something you did not do, when rumour moves faster than truth, when your future depends on someone else's mood at breakfast. In those moments the air tastes different. Every sound becomes an omen. You rehearse your defense, not because it will be heard, but because it is the only way to stop the shaking in your hands. The ravens in the courtyard were my most reliable companions. They did not flatter. They did not lie. They did not demand an explanation. They simply watched, as if they knew what the rest of the world refused to admit, that my life could end with a signature, and the ink was already drying somewhere. Nights were the longest. The wind threaded itself through the cracks in the stones, carrying whispers I could almost believe were voices. I learned to sleep lightly, not because I wanted to wake, but because I feared not waking at all. Food arrived without words. I did not know whether the next meal would be followed by a priest. But fear is a strange teacher. It begins as an enemy, all teeth and shadow, and then, if you sit with it long enough, it becomes something else. Not a friend exactly, but a map. I began to notice how my fear rose and fell with certain sounds, certain faces. I started naming it, as one might name a storm, and in naming it, I found I could watch it without drowning in it. Some days I paced the cell, imagining I was walking through gardens I might never see again. Other days I sat perfectly still, listening to the drip of water far away, as if it were counting the moments I had left, and sometimes I laughed, quietly to myself, at the absurdity of it all. So this, I thought, is what it comes to, the daughter of a king, guarded more closely than the crown jewels. If you are in such a place now, perhaps not of stone, but of circumstance, know this. The mind will try to convince you that the walls are the whole world. they are not. Keep a piece of your thoughts for yourself. Hide it where no jailer can find it. Let it be your candle. 2 months passed this way. I measured them not by dates, but by the way the light changed through the narrow window. Grey, then gold, then grey again. I did not know if I would walk out of the tower alive. And then, one morning, the door opened. It opened not with ceremony, but with the weary creak of wood and iron. A voice told me I was free to leave. Just like that. No explanation, no apology. I stepped into the courtyard, the sky startlingly wide, the air sharp with the scent of rain. And I swore, right there, that if I ever had the chance to live freely again, I would never waste a single day. Though, as I would soon discover, the world had other plans for me. Freedom is a peculiar thing. After the tower, it felt like stepping into sunlight, only to find the shadows were following. My release had not cleared my name. It had simply moved me to a different kind of cell, the kind with velvet cushions and gilded ceilings. 4 years later, when the crown finally rested on my head, I knew I was trading one set of watchful eyes for another. The first meeting of my Privy Council was held in a chamber that smelled of ink and damp wool. The walls were panelled in dark oak, heavy with history, and the air was thicker still with doubt. 20 men, most of them twice my age, sat around a table long enough to hold a feast. Their faces were polite, but their eyes were measuring, not my gown or my jewels, but the weight of my will. They spoke in turns, voices rich with the certainty of men who had been advising monarchs since I was a child. They debated policy, religion, the treasury, the treasury most of all, as if the kingdom itself could be balanced on an abacus. I let them speak. It was not ignorance that kept me silent, but strategy. Observation, I had learned, is not passive. It is the sharpening of a blade before it is drawn. You may have been in such a room yourself. A new job, a new project, a table of strangers who are not sure you belong there. Perhaps they look at you and see only inexperience, or the wrong kind of experience. In those moments it is tempting to fill the air with your voice, to prove yourself quickly. But there is another way. Let them reveal themselves first. Watch the alliances, the hesitations, the words that make them lean forward and the ones that make them bristle. I waited until the discussion on taxes, and it was endless, truly, had looped on itself for the 3rd time. Their discussions on taxes could have outlasted a winter. When the murmurs settled, I leaned forward, my hands folded loosely before me. "Gentlemen," I said, "if we spend the next hour deciding how many angels can dance upon the head of a pin, the pin will still be there, but the angels will be gone. Let us choose what matters today and leave the rest for tomorrow." The line was not in any manual of governance. It was simply my way of reminding them that while they circled problems, the world outside the chamber kept moving. A few men smiled despite themselves. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing that silence does not equal absence. Over the months that followed, I learned the rhythm of that room, when to listen, when to speak, when to let 2 rivals wear each other out before placing my own suggestion neatly in the space they had emptied. Words, I discovered, are more dangerous than swords, and far more precise. Still, No matter how many decisions we made, there was one question that never left the table. It came in the form of raised eyebrows, formal letters from foreign courts, and the occasional blunt inquiry from my counsellors. Marriage. Would I take a husband? When? Whom? And then came the matter of marriage, the question everyone asked, and I never answered the way they wanted. If my council had their way, I would have been married before the ink on my coronation documents had dried. For them, a queen without a husband was a gap in the wall, an invitation for trouble to walk right in. For foreign ambassadors, I was the greatest prize on the continent, a political alliance wrapped in silk and pearls. Letters arrived in endless waves. Each carried the same polite insistence. I must choose, and quickly. A husband would bring stability, heirs, and, though they rarely said it aloud, a man to guide my rule. I smiled at that. After all, I had survived the tower, navigated a council full of men old enough to be my grandfathers, and kept my crown steady in storms they could barely see coming. I did not require a guide. It is a strange thing to know the world has already written your life before you have lived it. Perhaps you know the feeling, the gentle, relentless nudges toward a path you never asked to walk. When will you marry? When will you have children? When will you settle down? And when your answers do not match the script, the looks grow sharper, the tone more concerned, as though deviation were a symptom of illness. I did consider the offers, not out of loneliness, but out of duty. Marriage could mean peace with a rival power, gold for the treasury, an army at my back. Yet every time I imagined it, the picture dimmed. I saw myself not as a queen, but as a pawn moved by another's hand. So I gave my answer in the only way I knew would be remembered. I am already bound unto a husband, the kingdom of England. It was not a line of poetry, though some treated it as such. It was my truth. My devotion would not be split between England and any man. Still the suitors came, princes from Spain and Sweden, archdukes from Austria, the King of France himself. Their portraits arrived first, painted to flatter, though not all succeeded. One, I swear, had eyes that seemed to look in different directions, as if he could guard the palace and the stables at once. Another had a jaw so square I feared he might use it to batter down city gates. My ladies tried not to laugh when we examined them, but I encouraged it. A little laughter is a fine shield against the weight of expectation. Refusing marriage was not a single act, it was a constant one. Every envoy I turned away brought whispers of danger, rebellion at home, invasion from abroad, and yet each time I looked at my kingdom, its green fields, its restless seas, its people who had placed their trust in me, I knew my choice was the right one. I would not trade my freedom or theirs for a crown shared unequally. But while I refused one union, I could not avoid another. England's union with war. The summer of 1588 began with a stillness that felt unnatural. It was the kind of stillness sailors dread, the kind that sits on the water just before a storm. Word had come from across the Channel. Spain, with all its gold and ships, was sending an armada to unseat me and claim England, the largest fleet Europe had ever seen, gilded and bristling with cannon. In moments like this, you do not have the luxury of fear. Fear is a whisper you hear later, when the noise has gone. In the moment, there is only the work, letters to my admirals, orders for supplies, messages to every port town to ready their defences. Even the sea seemed to be holding its breath. I travelled to Tilbury to speak to the troops, the men who would stand between England and ruin. They were farmers and fishermen, merchants and labourers, not professional soldiers. Some wore armour, polished for the first time. Others wore none at all, and yet they stood, eyes fixed on me, waiting to know if the crown on my head meant anything when the cannons began to roar. I remember the wind lifting the edge of my cloak as I began. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. It was not the first time I had spoken those words, but it was the first time I had meant them in the marrow of my bones. I told them I trusted them with my life, that I would fight beside them if the Spanish landed on our shores, and as I spoke, I could feel the air change. Words, when they are true, have a weight that armour cannot match. Perhaps you know this feeling, when all eyes are on you and the room waits for you to decide whether it will rise or sink. It might be a boardroom, a classroom, a hospital corridor, or your own kitchen. In those moments, you do not need to be perfect. You need to be steady enough for others to steady themselves against you. The battle, when it came, was not fought as Spain had planned. Their great ships were met by English fireships in the dark, and by winds that tore their formation apart. The Spanish had gold, we had weather, and a talent for bad surprises. The Channel became a churning battlefield, cannon smoke mixing with sea mist, the air sharp with salt and powder. By the time the Armada limped home, battered and half-starved, England had held. There were celebrations in London, bells ringing for days, but I knew better than to think the danger had passed entirely. Victory is a thin blanket. It keeps you warm for a night, but the cold returns in the morning. When the cannons fell silent, I discovered something far heavier than armour, the weight of being alone at the top. Victory brought with it banquets, masks, and an endless string of celebrations. Whitehall Palace glowed like a furnace of gold one evening, the long galleries lit with hundreds of candles whose flames bent and swayed in the fickle draughts. Shadows danced on carved oak panels. Music from lutes and viols drifted over the polished marble, mingling with bursts of laughter and the crystalline chime of goblets colliding in toast. The air itself seemed thick with perfume, roasted meats, and the faint tang of beeswax. The great gallery shimmered with life, silks catching the light like the scales of exotic fish, jewels blinking like constellations trapped in motion. Courtiers drifted across the floor in elaborate patterns, their brocades rustling like the wings of tropical birds. It was the picture of triumph. England's queen, undefeated, surrounded by her loyal court, her reign gilded by recent victories. From the outside it was perfect. From where I stood, at the tall windows overlooking the Thames, the black water reflecting the candle-lit windows like a scattering of fallen suns. It felt less like a room I inhabited and more like a painting I had been placed in. The brush strokes were flawless, but the canvas was cold. Everyone spoke to me, yet I had no one to speak to. Smiles met me at every turn, but they were the kind that stopped short of the eyes. They spoke the language of courtesy, of loyalty rehearsed, of affection performed. Beneath the embroidery and etiquette lay a strange distance, as if I were a relic on display, admired but untouchable. Perhaps you know this paradox. The more visible you are to the world, the less you are truly seen. You spend years climbing toward the pinnacle, thinking that when you arrive the air will be clear and the view will be endless. And in a way it is. But the higher you stand, the thinner that air becomes, until conversation feels like breathing through silk. I had won the title, the recognition, the place at the head of the table, and yet most exchanges skated across the surface like stones on water. I was known, thoroughly, universally, and yet unknown. They carried in their minds the idea of me, but not the truth of me, and so the gaps in their knowledge were filled with something else. Gossip. Not the harmless whispers of a marketplace, but the soft, persistent murmurs that travel through a court like smoke, curling into every corner, until the walls themselves seem to repeat them. Some swore I never slept. Others were certain I slept all day. One rumour insisted I survived on nothing but sugared violets. Another that I concealed a suit of armour beneath my gowns. A few whispered that I had an identical double, a perfect twin, who attended the tedious council meetings in my place while I wandered the gardens. That one, I confess, I almost wished were true. The truth was more ordinary, and perhaps more damning to those who preferred their myths. I worked until my eyes burned. I took my meals when I remembered to, and I attended every council session, whether I wished to or not. But myths are stubborn creatures. In the endless chatter of the court, they flourish better than truth. And so even in a hall overflowing with people, I felt the edges of solitude. Companionship, I learned, is not simply the nearness of bodies. It is the presence of trust. And in the upper chambers of power, trust is rarer than a summer without rain. At times the noise itself became oppressive, the polite laughter that never reached the heart, the calculated flattery that landed like drops of oil on the surface of water, glistening but never mixing. My victories were paraded before me like trophies, yet they felt strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. When the air grew thin, I did what I had always done. I sought oxygen in my own words. The windows by which I stood were ajar, and the night air carried with it the scent of the river. Cool, mineral, touched with the faint smoke of distant hearths. Down on the water, barges drifted silently, their lanterns winking in and out behind the pilings. For a moment I imagined myself slipping away into one of them, vanishing into the darkness, becoming no one. But queens cannot vanish. They can only retreat into smaller rooms, into quieter hours, into the company of voices they trust. And for me, those voices had always come from the page. So when the music swelled and the dancers swept past me in another glittering arc, I stepped back from the window and withdrew to my chambers, The transition from the gilded roar of the gallery to the hush of my private rooms was like plunging into cold water, shocking but clean. The tapestries muffled the echoes. The single fire in the grate gave a steadier, truer light than all the candles in Whitehall. On the table by the hearth lay a stack of fresh paper, a pot of ink and my seal. The sight of them eased something in my chest. Here was a world where words were chosen, not thrown, where thoughts could be set down before they were judged, where I could speak without weighing the consequences of every syllable. I picked up the quill. The first lines came slowly, as they always did, my mind still shedding the voices of the hall, but soon the ink began to flow more easily, my hand moving with the quiet urgency of a bird, building its nest, twig by twig. I wrote to those few who knew me without the armour of the crown, old friends, trusted allies, the rare souls who had seen me unadorned and unguarded. I told them of the victories, yes, but also of the weariness behind them. I confessed the loneliness that clung to the edges of celebration, the way a shadow clings to light. In those moments, with the quill scratching softly against the page and the fire settling into its quiet crackle, I was not a sovereign or a symbol. I was simply a woman who had fought hard, who had won much, and who still, in the silent hours, needed to remind herself she was real. And so I turned to the only confidants who never betrayed me, my letters. At night, when the palace finally settled into its creaks and sighs, I would retreat to my private chambers and light a single candle. The rest of the room stayed in shadow. I preferred it that way. There, with a quill in hand, the weight of the crown seemed to loosen just enough for me to breathe. Writing was the only place where I could be entirely myself. Not a queen, not a symbol, just Elizabeth. The page didn't flatter me, nor did it judge. It listened. I could write my triumphs without boasting, my fears without shame. Some letters were meant for others, ambassadors, allies, rivals, though the truest sentences were the ones no one would ever read. Perhaps you know this ritual in another form, the journal you keep hidden in a drawer, the long unsent message on your phone, the voice memo you record and delete. These are the conversations we have with ourselves when the world is too noisy to hear us clearly. Of course, my words did not always reach their destination intact. Palace scribes were responsible for making fair copies, and while some were careful, others were imaginative. More than once, a simple line of mine reappeared in a final draft as an entirely new sentiment, courtesy of a scribe who fancied himself a poet. I asked for clarity, I once muttered, not riddles. I half wondered if foreign courts thought me more mysterious than I intended, simply because my handwriting was difficult to read. Still, the act of writing mattered more than where the letters landed. On paper, I could set down the thoughts I dared not speak aloud, doubts about the loyalty of certain nobles, worries about the harvest, the private griefs I kept behind my public composure. The candle would burn low, wax pooling on the desk, the room carrying that faint smell of smoke and ink. Outside the window, the Thames moved silently through the city, a dark ribbon carrying secrets toward the sea. I like to imagine my words travelling in the same way, drifting quietly into the night, finding their own course. But no letter could shield me from the loss that came next, the loss of the man I trusted most. Robert Dudley was no stranger at the fringes of my life. He had been at its centre for as long as I could remember. Son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, Robert was born into privilege and peril in equal measure. We met as children in the shimmering yet treacherous world of King Henry's court, running in the same corridors, learning the same lessons about loyalty, ambition and survival. We were both shaped by the same fires, the constant shifting of favour, the sudden falls from grace, the knowledge that a smile could hide a dagger. We grew up together as companions in a place where friendship was rare and always conditional. We saw one another in triumph and disgrace. We both endured imprisonment in the Tower, I for suspicion of treason under my sister Mary, he after his family's failed plot to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. That shared shadow bound us in ways nothing else could. He knew the way my temper could flare like a struck match and then vanish in the next breath. He knew my silences, that they were not empty but deliberate, often saying more than words could. In a world where every conversation was weighed like coin, Robert's words were the rarest kind, unmeasured, unguarded, not careless but honest. It was his honesty, dangerous, exhilarating, that made him unlike any other man at court. Our connection was impossible to name cleanly. To some he was the great love of my life, to others a dangerous shadow too close to the throne. He was at once my most trusted friend, my sharpest adviser, my rival in wit, my confidant in despair. There were days I trusted him as I trusted no other man, and moments I distrusted him as I distrusted all men. That paradox, affection laced with caution, was the thread we never stopped pulling, even when it frayed. Perhaps you have known someone like this yourself, the one who sees you more clearly than you see yourself, whose presence can steady you in the storm, and whose absence leaves a silence so deep you can almost hear it, the one whose closeness feels both like safety and risk. In the summer of 1588, not long after England's unlikely triumph over the Spanish Armada, that silence found me. Robert Dudley was gone. The news came not in fanfare or public announcement, but in the quiet weight of a sealed letter brought to me at Richmond. I knew the hand before I broke the seal. The writing, once bold, was now uneven, the strokes trembling. Inside were 4 words only: your most faithful friend. No name, none was needed. I sat with that page in my lap for a long time before I read it again. There was no courtly flourish, no strategy, no polished rhetoric, only the distilled truth of decades, the quiet acknowledgement of a bond that had survived the rise and fall of families, the suspicion of others, and the demands of a crown. I placed that letter in a small casket beside my bed and never moved it for the rest of my life. It was not a relic of romance to be sighed over, nor a political token to be displayed. It was proof that in a court built on performance and pretense, something unvarnished had managed to survive. Grief, however, is not a crown a queen can wear in public. The court still needed to be dazzled. The people still expected a figure of certainty and strength, and so I learned to hold my face in place, to polish my presence until it shone, and to keep the wound invisible beneath the silk and jewels. But the mask I wore in those days was not merely for the court. It became part of me. Every smile was measured, every word balanced on the edge of expectation. I had worn armor before, but this was different. Armor protects the body. A mask protects the self. After Robert was gone, I pulled that mask tighter than ever. I told myself it was necessary for the stability of the realm, for the dignity of the crown. But masks, if worn too long, grow heavy. They reshape the face beneath them. And as the years passed, I found that the mask I had once put on by choice had begun to feel like something I could no longer remove. That is the truth no one writes in their histories. Victories have their cost, but so does survival. And sometimes the heaviest price is not paid in public, but in the quiet hours, when you sit alone with a letter that says only your most faithful friend and realize you will never hear that voice again. Each morning began not with a sunrise, but with a transformation. Before the first council meeting, before the first envoy crossed the threshold, there was the ritual, as precise and deliberate as any military drill. My ladies would arrive carrying small pots and brushes, their hands steady from years of practice. They mixed the white lead paste, a dangerous concoction, though we did not know then how dangerous, and spread it carefully over my skin, one thin layer after another, cool at first, then almost warm as it settled, until no trace of fatigue, shadow, or human imperfection remained. Rouge for the lips, a precise shape for the brows, a hint of colour at the cheeks. Then came the wig, a crown of auburn curls, styled exactly as the court expected. It was not my natural hair, but my chosen hair, the one the portraits would record for history, the one foreign ambassadors would carry back in their descriptions, and finally jewels at the ears, rings at the fingers, a ruff framing my face like the setting around a precious stone. It was not vanity, it was armour. In a court where a single offhand remark could grow into a storm of rumour, I understood that appearances were the first line of defence. This face, this hair, this presence, they were not meant to please me, but to signal to everyone else, you are meeting the Queen of England, not the woman Elizabeth. Perhaps you know this in your own way, the perfect profile picture, the polished resume, the curated online posts where every word and image is chosen with care, the smile at the family gathering when you're exhausted inside, the I'm fine that you wear like a shield. These are masks too, not always false, but selective, chosen, necessary. I learned early that the mask could be a tool. In diplomacy, it allowed me to conceal my intentions. In counsel, it kept my emotions from being read and used against me. It let me play the game of power without showing my cards. But like any armour, it came with a cost. Weight. And I do mean weight. The gowns I wore, layered with silk, velvet, gold thread embroidery, and sometimes even metal stitching, could weigh more than a small child. I remember once standing for hours during a reception, smiling through conversations with ambassadors, my back aching under the stiffened bodice. I leaned to the lady beside me and whispered, "If the palace walls ever fall, my dress could serve as a fortification. She nearly choked on her wine, trying not to laugh. But heavy as the fabric was, the true burden was in the constancy of the role. To be the queen in public was to be the queen in every moment. No casual walks in the gardens without eyes upon you, no slipping into a chapel unannounced, no moments where you could simply be a woman. Even joy had to be measured, lest it be mistaken for weakness. The mirror was my daily accomplice and my daily adversary. In it I saw the version of myself that the world believed in, ageless, unchanging, untouchable, but I also knew the woman behind that image, the one whose skin had grown paler over the years, whose hands bore the lines of time, whose thoughts often wandered far beyond the duties of the day. Some mornings it felt as though the woman and the queen had become two entirely separate beings, and the act of binding them together was the true performance. You may have felt this yourself, the distance between who you are and who you must be for others. It is not always deceit, sometimes it is survival. We show the version of ourselves that can endure the world's demands, and we keep the rest safe, hidden where it cannot be bruised. Still, even the most skilled performer feels the strain when the play runs too long. I began to notice small rebellions in myself, moments when I wished I could enter the council chamber with my hair unpinned, or speak without the measured cadence of statecraft, times when I envied the scullery maids for their freedom to laugh loudly without worrying how it would be interpreted in a foreign court. There is power in the mask, yes, but there is also danger in forgetting the face beneath it. The longer you wear it, the more you risk believing it is the only face you have. I saw other rulers in other lands lose themselves entirely to the roles they played, until they could no longer tell where the performance ended and the person began. I swore I would not let that happen to me, and yet I felt the crown pressing harder on my temples with each passing year. The public still saw Gloriana, triumphant and unshaken. They saw the victory over the Armada, the confident speeches, the dazzling gowns, but behind the mirror I saw a woman measuring her days more carefully now, aware that time, the one force no sovereign can command, was drawing her toward an end she could neither prevent nor postpone. There is an odd kind of clarity that comes with that awareness. You start to choose more deliberately the battles you will fight, the words you will speak, the company you will keep, and you begin quietly to imagine the moment when you will no longer have to hold the pose, but even queens must put down their crowns, and I felt the last sunrise of my reign approaching. I wake to a light unlike any other, softer, slower, as if the sun itself is reluctant to rise. The air carries a stillness that feels ceremonial. My hands, resting on the coverlet, are the same hands that once signed decrees, commanded fleets, and held the fate of a nation between two fingers. Now they simply rest. I do not feel sadness, not exactly, but a weight, the kind that comes from knowing an era is about to close. I think of legacy, not the kind written in marble or stitched in gold on a banner, but the quieter kind, the laws that endured, the scholars I protected, the children of strangers who grew up in a safer land because I held the line. We imagine that legacy is a monument, with our name engraved in stone, but in truth it is a ripple. It moves unseen, touching shores we will never visit. In the modern world, you might call it impact. You might measure it in likes, followers, or the reach of your words. But I know better. True impact is not measured in applause, but in the quiet changes that take root in the dark, long after you have gone. The stranger who holds open a door because kindness once held the door for them. The student who dares to speak because someone once dared to listen. These are legacies worth more than any crown. The window is open and the air smells of damp earth. I remember riding through the countryside as a young woman, my hair loose under the wind, before the crown, before the weight. I wonder, had I known the cost, would I still have chosen the throne? My mind answers before my heart has the chance to hesitate. Yes, because even in the hardest nights, the work was worth the weariness. And yet, I see now that power is only borrowed. We are custodians, not owners. When our time comes, the scepter passes on, and we are measured not by the size of our reign, but by the steadiness of our hand while holding it. There's a parallel for you, living centuries ahead. The job you have, the title on your desk, the house you own, these too are borrowed. One day they will belong to someone else, and all that will remain is how you use them. Did you make life softer for those around you? Did you bring more light than you took? The candle on my desk burns low, its wax pooling at the base like the years I have left, fewer now than before, but still warm, still giving light. Outside the garden stirs, a robin hopping from branch to branch, a gardener lifting his face to the sky as if to guess the weather. I envy him a little. His kingdom is the soil, his battles fought with rain and weeds, yet perhaps our work was not so different, both of us tending something we hoped would grow. I remember a phrase I once spoke to a restless young noble. We may not control the wind, but we can set our sails. He had been impatient, eager to bend the world to his will. I told him the truth. The wind does not answer to us, but our hands are free to choose the angle, the course, the persistence. I believe that still. It is, perhaps, the only thing I am sure of. My body feels smaller now, but my vision stretches farther than it did in my youth. I see that all reigns, royal or ordinary, end the same way, in the surrender of the crown, whether it is made of gold or of daily responsibilities. What matters is that, when you set it down, you know it was never just about you. The sun is higher now, painting the room in soft gold. The air warms against my skin. I think of all the faces that have passed through my life. Friends, rivals, lovers, enemies. Each one in their own way was a teacher. They taught me how to hold power without letting it hollow me out. Though in truth, I sometimes failed at that. Still, the lessons stayed. If I could speak to you, you who listen in the quiet of your own night, I would say this: do not wait for a title, a crown, or permission to matter. You matter now, exactly as you are. Do not chase permanence in monuments. Chase it in kindness, in courage, in the way you make people feel when they leave your presence. That will last longer than stone. I close my eyes, and the golden light settles behind my lids. Like a blessing, there will be no more decrees, no more speeches, only rest, and that is enough. Because in the end the crown was never the point. The point was the hands I held, the storms I steered through, the sails I set, knowing the wind was never mine to command, and as sleep begins to take me, I feel no fear, only the deep, quiet truth. The voyage goes on, and so does the light. Farewell, dear listener. May your nights be crowned with peace, and your days with quiet triumphs.